Hello, I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there in person today. We've had in my family a death in our family, and that has been what has kept me a little unfocused at school and absent from our presentations today. But I thought about it and wanted to at least record something to share with you to reflect on what I've been doing and the process. So I'm just going to briefly tell you, I set out to survey or create sort of a baseline of understanding on the education system in El Salvador. Why El Salvador? I lived there for 2 years and I worked with youth in a rural community. And during the course of that time, I learned a lot about the people and the history and the genocide that occurred through two civil wars that this country, very small country, experienced. Today, as a result, there are only about 10% of the people that identify as indigenous. Um, and so I wanted to take a look at that in terms of what it meant for indigenous people and the education system that exists in El Salvador. So let's see, I wanted to look at the educational experience for indigenous students and how their ways of knowing are taught or supported or not supported by the national school system that they call MINED, which stands for the Ministerio de Educación. So the questions that I focused on were where do indigenous students receive their education? Is it within the NED public school system? So are they incorporated or are they completely isolated from the general education system? Are there specific schools that serve small indigenous populations? And are indigenous are indigenous does the current indigenous system include ways to preserve and celebrate indigenous heritage? So those were kind of some key guiding questions that I was working on. In framing my questions, and the background of my assumptions came from critical theory or possibly even post-colonial theory, given the fact that of the history of El Salvador, and that they're recovering from a legacy of indigenous genocide, which really has left like this cultural void for young people today, of not really having a sense of identity and connectedness to their country, which is why we see such migration happening right now into the U.S. Okay, for my lit review, I found lots of resources on Aboriginal communities, but not so much that speak to the specifics of El Salvador. So I thought I was very limited in drawing conclusions in a formal way, although, I kind of had my suspicions or assumptions, which were that indigenous people in El Salvador they go to school with everyone else that doesn't identify as indigenous, and they're learning more assimilated, they're going through an assimilated education process, and most of their ways of knowing are being passed down through family and generations orally and through their own celebrations in their community, and they're keeping themselves very, very isolated. So those are kind of what's going on right now for them. What I did find out so far was that the Salvadoran Education Office, or MINED, has a general education model. It's applied nationally, but indigenous ways of knowing are seldom talked about and in the classroom, and there's not much of a set curriculum on a national level to introduce these things. They do have supplemental activities nationally that are tying the schools to religious events. So it ties Catholicism and with indigenous songs and dance. So for Easter or Semana Santa, or for Dia de la Virgen de Guadalupe, which is the Day of the Virgin Mary in December, are kind of the two major times where nationally these indigenous songs and dance are accepted. Given that there's little formal information regarding this topic, I decided I would like to conduct some semi-structured interviews with the indigenous population, as well as with teachers in a couple of indigenous schools. So let me backtrack a little. well, it requires more time, so it's beyond the scope of this class. So it's something that I'll be conducting over Thanksgiving in the next couple of weeks. So in the meantime, I did set up a preliminary interview on Skype with a liaison. It's a doctor that I've worked with, that has a lot of trust in the Indigenous community, because he's from there and because he is a doctor. So he works with two communities in El Salvador called Nahuizalco and Izalco. And so, in talking with him, I learned that there are two schools that are Minet schools, but they are teaching Nahuapipil, which is the native language, as well as incorporating activities of traditional ways of knowing of Indigenous people. So, in talking with him, have set up 5 more interviews with folks within the community, the Indigenous community, as well as teachers of those schools. So I hope to learn more, and in my semi-structured interviews, apply phenomenology theory, which is to see what themes emerge, and have a more thorough analysis. Thanks for listening, and I've struggled as well as enjoyed this class. As I have said many times, education is powerful and it can be used in a good way as well as a bad way. And I think that's where I'm still being very, very aware of how we're including everyone. Thanks.